All right, we're all here? Are we all here?
More or less.
More or less. Okay. Okay. So, let's kind of notice, say to ourselves, even though it sounds like a joke, I'm still alive. Of course, it's a joke because Buddha would say there's this deep primordial assumption, again, another misconception that we've practiced for eons, that things are permanent, things don't change, because we can't stand change. So we've overlaid this lie onto everything. So then, because this is the status quo, I'm alive today, we just assume, of course I'll be alive tomorrow. It's deep in our bones, which is why we are so shocked when things change. So here we are, assuming I'm permanent. I mean, we'd never say it because we think it's stupid. We know we're going to die, but there's an assumption in there. So we have to counteract that assumption. So we notice, oh my God, I'm still alive. So we take the Buddha's view. We think the reason I'm alive isn't because I'm healthy, isn't because I'm young, isn't because I'm clever, isn't because I'm happy. It's because, the Buddha would say, the accumulation of our morality karmic imprints, the programming of morality in the mind, this is the main cause of being, of especially non-harming, non-killing. The habitual energy of non-harming from the past, one track of it is the cause of having petrol in our petrol tank still, that causes us to still be alive, all the elements to be working together, the breath coming in and out, all the conditions that are called life. This is the Buddha's explanation. So we go, wow, amazing, far out, can't believe it, how fortunate. And then we think, so what's the point? Well, this human birth, all the conditions come together, especially the access to intelligence. We've got intelligence, we've got virtue, but we have the conditions that allow us, We're not living in a desert, or we have to, we're not living in some poor place where we have to work 18 hours a day to get one bowl of rice just to breathe. We have this incredible good fortune of having enough dollars somewhere or euros somewhere, even if it's on a credit card. How fortunate, how kind Mr. Bank to lend me the money so I can come here in leisure to listen, think about methods to help me develop my amazing potential so I can be of benefit to others. I mean, what a luxury, It's like we're part of the 1% on this earth, not the rich 1%, the fortunate 1%. And who created it? We did. So getting an incredible sense of, not just, oh, aren't I lucky, or, oh, the universe is kind to me, or thank you, God. That's okay, you can have those, but the Buddha says, thank you for my own past hard work. How amazing. So let's make the most of this marvellous, precious human rebirth. For this reason, so we can develop our qualities, so we can be of benefit to others, one step at a time. Sangye charang soke chok namla Jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi Dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki Drola penche sangye dropa shok Sangye charang soke chok namla Jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi Dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki Drola penche sangye dropa shok Sangye charang soke chognam la jancho badu dagni kyab suchi Dagi chernyen gipe sonam ki Drola penche sangye dropa sho. So let's look at this delusion, this other one, this delusion. Before we were always talking about this hierarchy of the delusions in the mind when it comes to the different states of mind, all the unhappy emotions we have, which we recognize so well, But there's all these other misconceptions. I mean, the Buddha would suggest, as we've been saying, that it's a misconception that your mind is physical. He says this is not true. He would say it's a misconception that your mother made you. He would say it's a misconception that a creator made you. He's not being rude, he's not being critical, he's not being fundamentalist. He's telling you his observations, And it's up to us to think about it or not. I mean, he's not the boss. He's just telling us what he sees to be true. And a person chooses to take on board his views as their working hypothesis to give it a go, This is all I'm doing. It's the way to put it. Be very relaxed about it. We're so used to hearing religion as fundamentalist and belief, like it's being squeezed down our throat, like, force-fed. Don't think of it this way. It's just so mistaken, Be relaxed about it. You might think Buddha's ideas are completely ridiculous. You're allowed to. But relax. Have the courage to listen if you want to, to see if there's something in there that you're prepared to give it a go. It's okay, no pressure. So, okay, one of these many misconceptions of the mind, you would say, is this, as they call it, grasping at permanent me. And this is a really good stepping stone, actually. To understand this one and to meditate on this one, to get a sense of this one, is a very powerful stepping stone to understanding the emptiness of the me, This kind of can lead to it. So Buddhist teachings, they're very extensive in the literature, very extensive teachings about this idea of impermanence, that things change from moment to moment. I mean, it's hardly rocket science. We all know that. That's why I keep saying Buddha doesn't invent this stuff. He simply has observed it, He takes the energy of the universe and articulates it like all scientists do, Botanists don't make up botany. They take the energy of the universe and articulate it and be skillful in using the natural energy of the universe, called sun, water, soil, seeds. That's what we're doing, and this is the Buddhist approach, as opposed to a creator making it. This is a major difference here. I mean, you might hear it as a major difference. Like Melanie yesterday thinking it sounds pretty similar, the punishment-reward business. That's okay, but think about it, whatever. So, okay, so here Buddha talks a lot about impermanence, and at one level he talks about, they refer to gross impermanence, or sort of like obvious to your eyes impermanence, like a flower. You can see the evolution of flowers easy. You can see it almost growing, especially little delicate flowers. You can literally see it coming and then going, within a few days. Everything we can see in this universe that we can see, the objects of our senses, everything, exists according to this law of impermanence, change, and it's also the law of cause and effect. You get this, you put it together, and it'll fall apart. Things are made up of many bits and pieces. Things come together, Everything that exists that we can see is like this. Various things come together, a flower is produced, and then it goes. Everything's like this. Mountains, universes, people, things, relationships, microphones. Whatever's made, in other words, we can see, and this is like a natural law, whatever's made of many bits can fall apart, does fall apart. So, okay, what is the implication for oneself in terms of one's practice, in terms of counteracting fears and dramas and suffering and ego? Well, one of our major sufferings is, even though we can see this very evidently, it's like because we have this fierce attachment, this fierce grasping, it's like we can't bear the thought that things change when we've got the nice things together. Like the relationship one especially, that's such a powerful one, We say the words, finally I have found happiness, we say. What we mean by that is, yes, indeed, you've got some person whom you have fallen in love with, who is a divine person, that gives so much pleasure, guaranteed. But we say, finally I've found it, which means now I've got it, put it in there, lock the key, throw the key away, and it's now permanent forever. That's what we think. So obvious by our words. Finally, I've got it. We can see one of our main sufferings is because we have found something that's marvellous, a delicious cake, but it changes. This is the suffering of change. It's so painful. We see, not because it's not suffering because it changes. It's because we assume it shouldn't, because we can't bear it. And so we've imposed this lie upon it. This is very easy to see. We can see we do this one. Emptiness is maybe much subtler, This one's so evident. We can see the suffering it causes. And this is Buddha's point across the board. The extent to which we have misconceptions is the extent to which we suffer. Whereas we think the extent to which something, my relationships finish and things break is the extent to which I suffer. No, not. Because it's natural that things break and change. It's nature. So this is already a tasty one. Nicole Kidman saying, and I always quote her, this poor woman, I love her, I think she's great. But just in this Vanity Fair article, it was so vivid, At the end of the article, she said, we will be together until we're 80. But then she said, and if we won't be, I will be devastated. All of that is so rich in this, when we unpack it and see that there's this assumption of permanence. We desperately want things to be forever. So it's kind of interesting. This is kind of a really fascinating point, actually. The Buddha's view is, his observation is that your consciousness is beginningless and endless. So that's forever, isn't it? Like eternity, we say. Oh, it sounds hilarious. Only religious people use eternity. And as soon as we say eternity, it sounds like hell or heaven. So eternity just means forever. And this is Buddha's observation. So, it's interesting in all the scientific findings these days, they may be coming up with the fact that maybe there wasn't the Big Bang. As Dalai Lama said in all these discussions with scientists, Big Bang, no problem. Just not the first Big Bang, that's all. There's been endless and beginningless Big Bangs. Things come into existence and go away, So this would be the Buddhist view, that the universe consists of two energies, if you like, consciousnesses, beings, living beings, mind possessors. The term in Tibetan is a lovely word, sem chen, mind possessors. And then there are the four elements, the physical universe, or the physical elements themselves, at whatever level, very subtle or very gross. And as I said, the Buddhist tantric teachings, as they call them, or the Vajrayana, the Mantrayana, there's the various terms for the highest, most sophisticated level of Buddha's views, Buddha's teachings, Buddha's observations, Buddha's methods, which is actually the model that the Tibetan medical system uses, which is a similar one to the Hindu one, of the prana, the subtle end. We've got gross, as I mentioned briefly, we have gross consciousness, mind, which comes along inextricably with gross physicality. In our case, this. In the lion's case, that, Our mind is conjoined. Our gross consciousness functions interdependently, independence upon this gross set of body, this gross set of the four elements. You can't have eye consciousness, which is the capacity of your mind, which is not physical, to see things, unless you've got an eyeball and the nervous system and your eyelid up and everything, all the conditions, the physical conditions conjoined with the eye consciousness. So body and mind for the Buddha, gross consciousness, subtle consciousness. This Buddhist view, according to Vajrayana, is that all minds, all mind streams, all consciousnesses have their own set of the four elements. I mean, this is obviously a completely different model from the materialist view. I understand that. I'm just saying it, if we want to hear it, All consciousnesses, just naturally, are conjoined inextricably with their own set of the four elements. There is no beginning to these consciousnesses, which is interesting because we always want the first moment. Every one of us, without exception, asks, when did it begin? When did karma begin? When did suffering begin? When did I begin? When did the world begin? It's kind of fascinating that we would have that question. It's kind of fascinating that we have that question. The Buddha would say it's an irrelevant question because things can't begin, because it's cause and effect. You can't have a first cause. You can't have a first thing that didn't have a cause. So in the creative religions, or that assert God, including the Hindus, they do say that. There is a being, an energy that is beyond the normal laws, that doesn't have a beginning, has always been. That has always been is exactly how Buddha would say about everything. It's not holy. It's just how it is. Matter. The elements have been there since the beginning of this time. Minds have been there. I mean, even as I say it, I kind of laugh, because instinctively, it's just nonsense to us. To think that my consciousness is beginningless, it sounds beyond end areas, and endless. Okay, so then it's conjoined with these four elements. So the gross level, we have this gross body, conjoined with our gross consciousness, concepts and sensory. Then when, let's say the time of death, and I'm not talking about impermanence here, I'm trying to stay on the track of impermanence, and why we should see things as impermanent, how helpful it is. And this first point I'm talking about is the obvious one of the things to meditate on, think about, the very first level of practice, the most obvious level of impermanence is gross impermanence. As opposed to subtle, which I'll mention later, which is more subtle, which is more it is subtle. And what that refers to is the very fact of something's coming into being implies simultaneously it's going out of being. You can't separate them. And that can only be really cognized, the meaning of this can only be cognized in subtle meditation. It's quite profound realization. But here the gross one's evident to anybody with half a brain, So the key point here, to give us a kind of real wake-up call, is to think about the gross impermanence of this person, and that's called death. kind of la-di-da, I will die. And why? Because the agenda here is not just going to get depressed, which is what we do now when we think of death, is to give us a wake-up call. This precious life that we have, we work so hard to get, how terrible. It will end soon, and because it's so hard to get another set of these conditions, because it needs an awful lot of virtuous karma to come together, and that's pretty evident if you take the view of karma, and you look at the world, look at all the humans, they got the human body, but look, they don't have the other conditions. They're kind of crazy or unhappy or delusional or poor or suffering or terrorist or mad or killing, lying, stealing. All the other conditions just are contradictory to using this human birth to develop virtue. So how fortunate we don't just have a human body, but we have the other conditions as well, that we worked hard to get, that our hard, our virtue, our generosity, our kindness, our non-lying and non-stealing and non-killing actions accumulated and manifest now as this life, as these conditions. We are the creators of these conditions. It's not a gift from someone else. It's not reward or punishment. It's the fruit of causes. So, then to appreciate how it is permanent, is not permanent, gives you the energy to not waste it. Because it will end. So we think about then impermanence. We think about how death is definite. The time of death is not definite. And what is the point at the time of death? I'll go into these things. So I've got so many heads floating around, so many ideas, I'm trying to put them all together now. I've lost the plot a bit. I've lost one of the things. Where was I before? I was talking about this. Okay, the Vajrayana view. Okay. So just say this one for sure. We've got gross consciousness. Okay, so I think I'll go through the death process now. There's two ways we meditate about death. One is thinking about how death is definite, using your practical kind of analysis to analyse and counteract the instinctive grasping at permanence. This is so necessary, a major part of the way we practice. The other one is to look at the death process and what occurs at the time of death, which is extremely helpful. I mean, this is the Buddhist view, taking the Vajrayana, not just the Vajrayana, but taking the different teachings from the Buddha and putting it together and explaining understanding the components of a person, and thereby understanding the deconstruction of those components, which is what we call death. And then indeed, the likely possibilities of what will happen after death. All this is gone to great depth in the Buddhist literature. So this is the Buddhist approach from the Vajrayana point of view. So we've got the gross elements, and this conjoined with our gross consciousness, sensory and conceptual, which, if you think about it, is all that's posited in the materialist world, isn't it? So this occurs. So when you go through the death process, this gross level ceases when you stop breathing. Well, that's when you're ready for the body bag. That's when they think death is. That's what brain death is. And what's interesting, the Buddhists would say you continue to go to subtle consciousness, and then even to what they call very subtle, this gradual dissolution or deconstruction of the person, from gross to subtle to very subtle. It's described in stages, which I will talk about. But what's really interesting, I've got this book on my iPad, I just looked at it a couple of years ago, last year maybe, a book by an American medical journalist, Nick Teresi, I think his name is, and it's called The Undead. Well, it's not about zombies, okay? It's a wonderful book. It's really, from all the findings, since all the business of, farming organs and doing transplants, which is marvellous, but he's really kind of looking at all the findings and all the contradictions, especially he's talking based in America and the different states and their views of what death is and the agreements that they used to be very simple what death is. Now he says it's all being thrown into the air because of various findings that are coming because of, let's say, this really big, the big movement in the world of medicine. And it's seen as like the top dogs in medicine. These are the guys who get the biggest prices. It's seen as the most elitist, if you like, the one of getting organs. So all this emphasis on finding, nice, fresh, dead people from car accidents. I'm not being sarcastic here. He talks a bit like this, but it's very factual, very interesting, all the findings. And then keeping them all alive, Keeping them alive, supposedly, keeping them breathing. As far as they're concerned, they're dead. But they're warm and the breath is going because they're keeping the lungs pumped and the heart beating. So for them, their view, taking the materialist view of what life and death is, they're brain dead. Therefore, the person is no longer there, whatever they mean by the person. But they're finding now so many contradictions. People come back to life. People have experiences, report experiences, the whole chapter on people's reports. And he's an atheist. He has no interest in, any view. He says he doesn't have any view at all about these things. He reports it. There's one whole chapter on all the different experiences of people on the operating table who are considered unconscious by the medicos, but who report vivid experiences of using the Buddhist terms for it, their subtle consciousness leaving the body. Some people say it's their soul, some people say it's their spirit. The Buddhists would refer to it as their subtle consciousness, a continuity of the gross one. I'll explain. Leaving the body and observing perfectly and reporting back exactly what everybody said, what they did, what the music they played, the jokes they cracked. Exactly. So often there's a response from the medicos of enormous cynicism. Well, they must have really made it up, blah, blah. No one believes. But he reports one example of one woman who had to have a really, really radical procedure. I can't remember the words now for that procedure. And she was virtually had to be made dead. It drained out, all that drained out, all this stopped completely. And from the medical point of view, there was no way there could be any consciousness. Not possible. But she had the most vivid experience. Reported exactly everything that happened. So all these, and I think it's great that these things are happening, because it's forcing the materialists, if you like, using that word, to re-question their views, I mean, one of these doctors, he said, I can say now with certainty that consciousness is not a function of the brain. I don't know what it is, but I can say it's not that. So I think it's really good that these things are happening, I mean, okay, this happens to fit with the Buddhist explanation. That your gross consciousness, the gross capacity for cognition, which is your sensory, which depends obviously on a working body, and your conceptual, which depends upon a working body and brain and so on. That ceases by the time you stop breathing. And I'll describe the process, what occurs at each stage. Then you get to where the brain seems to have stopped functioning, and the breath has stopped. When you watch what they call brain dead. But the Buddhist view, very clearly, you're not dead yet. The subtle consciousness, which is the same level of consciousness that we experience when we dream. So what's interesting, the death process is described exactly, and they say that the process of going to sleep and dreaming and waking up is exactly the same as the process of dying, going into this, what they call intermediate state, like a dream state, and then waking up, but another body. It's exactly the same physiological process, the way it's described using this model of the four elements, consciousness conjoined with them, all these different things, okay? So, when you stop breathing, your subtle consciousness is now functioning. Like a dream state. It can be, for that person, like a dream state. Or they could not, but like sometimes you don't notice your dream. So there mightn't necessarily be any awareness, But the mind is in the body still. And as for the Buddhist view, it's very easy to prove from this perspective that the mind is in the body, is that you can feel the warmth. If warmth is there, it implies consciousness is there. Consciousness. So this is interesting because in this book that I've edited, it's kind of like done chronologically. There's all the background chapters about impermanence and what the death process is. And then there's the 3 parts of this book, all the advice that the weeks and months before death, what to do, the days before death, what to do when the breath stops, what to do after the breath stops, what to do, blah, blah, blah. And then what to do the next weeks after that for the person, all the different practices to do to help the person. And so one of the things is, I'm sorry, my mind's going so fast. I lose track, it's ridiculous. I'm so sorry. God. So sorry. What happened? As soon as you start to think about it, it all crumbles, it all goes away. Where am I? Okay, never mind, it'll all come out. It'll all come. So what I talk about in Lama Zopa's book, okay. Yeah, the Lama Zopa's book is about what to do at the time of death and what. So okay, yes. One part of it, one section is the different scenarios. What to do in the different scenarios in which your loved one died. So the classic Buddhist teachings are to let the body stay for 3 days after the breath stops. So that just practically for most people, even Buddhists. One of my friends, an Australian nun, Yeshikado, she runs our hospice service in Brisbane called Karuna Hospice, and they've got like a couple hundred volunteers. They help everybody. It's not just Buddhists, you know, but it happens to be a Buddhist organisation. And it's palliative care mostly. They don't have a hospice. They go out and provide helpers for people, for the family, but especially to be with the person as they're going through the death process, which is the most precious gift you can give, you know. So one of the things she said is, even among the Buddhists, it's just most people don't have, so it's almost like you don't have the courage in a way, or you feel so freaked out about the whole thing to leave your body for 3 days, you know. I mean, it used to happen. My grandma, when she died, the Catholic nuns would come and pray, and you'd leave the body in the, you know, for a couple of days until they had the funeral. Well, from the Buddhist perspective, this perspective, 3 days is best to leave the body after the breath is stopped. There's a whole way to do. But most people don't even die at home. She said even those, you know, who are in hospital, often are sent home. No, sorry, most people die in hospital or even in a hospice scenario. Very few people actually die at home, which would be the ideal scenario. Because then you can have complete control over the situation, have the room very peaceful, have everything very nicely organised with no noise, really quiet, best scenario, you know. But hospitals, even though I said before, people are so kind, there's so much noise and it can be so distressing to a person, especially when they go through this process. So anyway, there are various scenarios. So the advice to be what to do if your loved one dies at home, what to do if your loved one dies in an accident, or dies suddenly, like drops dead in their soup, or dies in an accident. You know, you've got to be prepared to know, because it's sudden, it's all there, you know, what to do, how to help that person right then. What to do if your loved one dies in a hospital, and what to do if your loved one gives their organs. Well, this is an interesting one, because all the years, you know, many people, many Tibetan lamas have been asked what would be the scenario for a person. Okay, one of the things they say in the Tibetan Buddhist approach to death, the Vajrayana approach, you don't touch the body, you leave the body, because if you touch the body, it can disturb, even though the person's dead, their consciousness is still there, their subtle consciousness, but it can be very disturbing, so you would never touch the body. Best to leave it untouched for 3 days, best. Okay, there are certain things you do. You can put, you know, things on the crown, on the heart chakra, certain reasons which I can explain. But best to not touch. So therefore, you know, normal scenario in a hospital, maybe you get an hour if you're lucky. You know, so you've got to know your rights. You've got to be in control of the situation. Please close the door, and then you do certain things for like that 1 hour. But normally, you know, all these lamas, when they were asked what would be the scenario, how would it affect the person if they're going to have their organs cut out? Because clearly you can't hang around and have the organs, you know, going rotten. They want nice fresh organs. So I remember reading all the advice these lamas given, including Lama Zopa, whose book this is. They'd all say how marvellous, how fantastic to give your organs, such a precious gift. So, you know, your death will be very peaceful for you because of this virtue. But then just only recently that I realised from talking to people who know that in fact it's not how it is. And when I read this book, you're not, you know, you don't just die quietly in your room, you stop breathing, and then you have an hour, you say some prayers, and they quietly take the body and cut out the heart. No. They keep you all, if you're a white person, they keep you all pink and warm and toasty, you know. I remember this author saying, I wish they'd take as much care of me when I'm dying naturally as they do of the people whose organs they want. They put all the effort and money, he was suggesting, he wasn't being cynical like I'm sounding, because they want the organ, so that the immense amount of resources and money that are used to keep a dead person warm and toasty, so they can have their heart when it's convenient, and so then they keep you also warm and toasty with the blood beating, the heart beating, the lungs going on the operation table, where they then cut out your organs. So then the question for the Buddhists would be, because the body is warm, as Lama Zopa says, that indicates the mind is there. If the lungs are capable of breathing, that means the wind energy is there, that means the mind is there, according to their view of the mind. That means the person's there, except the gross consciousness has ceased. So he says, because the gross consciousness has ceased, because of the relationship to the senses, they won't feel anything. But the mind can still be aware that you're on this table having your heart cut out. So I'm not so sure now I want to give my organs. Thank you very much. I'd rather give my old rotten body to these doctors who learn how to be a doctor and give it, you know, cut all your pieces open. Much more beneficial, I think. This is my opinion. This is not Buddha's opinion, it's me. This is Robina's opinion, okay? Anyway, there's different pieces of advice, you know, in the different scenarios of what to do. If your loved one gives their organs, if your loved one dies in a hospital, if your loved one dies suddenly, if your loved one dies, you know, at home. The practices Rinpoche would recommend are similar, but the time scale is very different, you know. So clearly the point here is, from the Buddhist perspective, this book is called, actually, I mentioned it, I think, It's a ridiculous title for the world, but it's Lama Zopa's kind of style. How to help your loved ones enjoy death and go happily to their next rebirth. And he means that quite literally, you know. Because for the Buddhists, death is just this little stop on the way. It's a big drag, really, to give up this body and get another one so you can carry on. You know, it's like a big storm you've got to go through to get to the next life so you can carry on the job. So, yeah, okay. So the death process, let's go through it roughly. Let's describe briefly. So the Buddhist understanding of the components of a person, we have the 4 elements, as I mentioned. The 4 elements. And our mind, our consciousness is conjoined with that. We have gross, subtle, very subtle. So the death process is described in terms of 8 stages of this gradual deconstruction, if you like, of all these components. The falling apart of these components, the coming apart of these components. Going from gross to subtle to very subtle. So the ideal way to die is to have been meditating all your life during these Vajrayana practices that enable you, through these concentration techniques, to go through the process of gross consciousness to subtle, all the way to very subtle. And for a very good reason, because very subtle consciousness, the subtlest level of our conscious being, is the most unencumbered, the clearest, the most pure, the most potent, the most capable. Because it's not conjoined with all the junk and all the conceptions and all the rubbish, and it's the most capable of realizing emptiness and therefore removing all the obstacles and all the delusions from the mind and becoming enlightened. And the greatest yogis, the greatest meditators can do that. So there's one chapter in this book, as Lama Zopa calls it, death is what the yogis have been waiting for. Not because death. You see, we hear death as this kind of, you've got to go into some black hole and no one knows. It kind of sounds scary. But death is just a process from this perspective. It's just a process you've got to go through to drop this ridiculous body so you can go to get another one. So you can carry on the job. So you can become deathless. Now this term in Tibetan, chime, it means deathless. It sounds peculiar to us. So that you don't have to go through this process of samsara anymore, and now you can have control over it, and your consciousness, which is beginningless and endless, doesn't need to have these ridiculous bodies. So of course if you're a bodhisattva, which we've been talking about in the compassion wing, you will want to be reborn as a human to help others. So you'll happily choose a rebirth, but you'll be in control of it. You know, you won't have it's not driven by ridiculous karma. You're in control of the process. So these great meditators, and this is very common in the Tibetan tradition, you read about these great yogis, meditators spend their lives going to the subtle level, you know, doing all the work we're talking about, but perfecting this ability to get their mind to the subtlest level so that when they do die, they're completely ready for it. They can go through that process with complete control. No drama. They're ready for it. And then when they get to the very subtle consciousness, they can stay there for hours, days, weeks, months, if they need to meditate, to get the job done of whatever they have to do, get rid of all the rubbish, to become an enlightened being. That's how they talk. Okay? So, but for most of us, if we're not that advanced, then, you know, we go through death. And for most people, not even thinking about death, of course, it's a terrifying experience. Because why? Because most of us don't have any awareness of what comes after. We don't have clairvoyance. We can't see, is it true we'll go to heaven? We can't see, is hell true? We can't see we don't know if we're physical or not. You know, we don't know if reincarnation is true, and from our own experience, because we don't have any memory of it. Because the reason for Buddha is because the gross consciousness doesn't have that capability. I mean, we talk about not remembering a past life. Excuse me, it's only at 10 o'clock. We don't remember 90%, 99% of today. If you had to write down every second of everything you thought and said and did that's happened since you woke up, it would be miserable failures. Our gross conceptual mind just doesn't have the capacity. So talk about remembering past lives. We remember moments of previous experiences, don't we? It's like a moment. It's like putting our memory there. We can remember it now. Well, the Buddha's view is everything that happens, like I've said before, that we see and hear and think, it actually gets imprinted. One Lama said it's like every second we're taking photos. Every second, every millisecond. Whatever we think and experience and see and hear and touch and taste and smell is like taking a photo and storing it in our consciousness. So it is there, accessible to us. And as we remove all the delusions and get more and more powerful, more and more spiritually advanced, less and less delusion and ego and more virtue and goodness and bliss and clarity, then literally we can access that. That's what clairvoyance is. It's no big deal for the Buddha. It's clearly the capability of all minds. It's not some mystical, strange thing. One can do this. Because this is the nature of mind, he says. It's natural. It's natural. And whatever the mind does is imprinted in the mind. It doesn't get lost, you know. So, because we don't have access to all those memories, and we don't know about these things, and we've got all these different viewpoints, we've all got run around with different viewpoints. Some of us have the viewpoint of Buddhism, some have the viewpoint of Christianity, some have the viewpoint of materialism, you know. So they're the views that inform our experiences. But the commonest view in the materialist world, isn't it, that death is like this big black hole that you fall into. Well, the view is that you just stop. But there's this fear of it, you know. Enormous fear of it, isn't it? It's kind of interesting. And the fear is simply the fear of change. The fear of things not being the status quo. It's just that the death one is most powerful, isn't it? So this is back to the point about just understanding in theory the idea of impermanence. That there's nothing that stays stuck. And this can lead us to emptiness. There's nothing that can stay. You know, even there's a meditation they say it's really nice to do. I promise I do meditation. No. Never mind. I want to talk about it first. We will do. But this is meditation. Okay, the word meditation is the word to familiarise. Well, there's a level of meditation at the level of hearing. Then there's a level of meditation at the level of thinking and contemplating. Then there's a level of meditation where you taste it experientially, one step at a time, you know. Nevertheless, I will do.
Can I ask you a question?
Uh-huh.
I work at a children's hospice.
Yes, wonderful. Where?
In Berlin.
Okay.
It's called Sonnenhof.
Wonderful.
And I have children and their parents.
Yes, that's right.
It's very different with children than with adults, I find, because I also work at a...
Because they're young and more innocent, you mean, and less built-up dramas,
no,
or
for
what?
instance, and I try to, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I
Yes.
try to follow some instructions
Yes.
for me, and I start feeling what is right,
Uh-huh.
and what almost can't be done, for instance, the no touching.
That's
So
right.
I can tell the parents, please
Yes,
don't touch
that's
the child
right.
that just passed.
Yes, of course.
So I'm always curious because I see a lot of literature how to spiritually be there for
Yes.
the dead old people.
It's the same, no different.
Is it exactly the
No,
same?
not for the animals as well, sweetheart. It's exactly the same for any living being. For your dog, for your cat, for your grandma, and for your baby. Same. They go through the same process. Of course, each person's got a different capability. And each person can have a capability to understand or not understand. So there's different practices you can do depending. So one of the strongest ones... Okay, well, can we go into this when we get to the time of death? Can I say more about the death process? I'll get to this.
Yeah,
definitely. I will, definitely. It's a really important point. But what a marvellous job you have. It's so amazing. I remember I did a conference in Sydney at a hospital where this wonderful doctor runs he's part of the hospice for dying children. And to get over all these superstitions and the horrible stuff he's such a lovely man. It was such a nice conference. But I remember it was so nice, he had his morgue, he'd built this morgue looking like a nursery.
Yeah.
And so the little dying baby's in there, and then the kids, the young kids, the brothers and the sisters are walking in and out. Oh, come and meet my dead brother.
Yeah, that's what happens.
Same, so good,
It's
opening it up, stopping
death.
all the
There's
fear, that's right.
nobody's,
Because death is natural.
There's a lot of happiness, a lot
That's
of
exactly
fun,
right.
a lot of
Fantastic.
laughter,
There
actually.
you go. Amazing. And that's from the living people's point of view. But see, often I find what's so fascinating in the world, all the emphasis on this now, which is great, is for the living people. Get past our fears and our dramas. But we don't have the view of what's best for the dying person. Often it can be until they stop breathing, then we don't care.
No, not at all, because in that case it's all about the parents.
Precisely.
The parents are
That's right.
I don't blame them, but they're completely attached.
That's right, of course.
And their children are suffering because they can't go, because their parents sit next to them.
That's right, that's the trouble. This is the worst one. And this is why, understanding the Buddhist view, the point of all these instructions in this book I've got of Lama's Opens, that we can keep remembering the purpose. The purpose of everything in there is, the reason is for the dying person. We are there to facilitate their death, their good rebirth. That's the meaning of the title. Why the title, And that's really takes time to get used to. And you've got to take on board here at least the idea that your loved one will go to heaven. Like as Lama Zopa says, one of the many practices, you talk to the person when they're still alive. So if it's your grandma and she's a Christian, you talk about heaven. You describe heaven, how beautiful, how lovely it is, how her loved ones are there. So she can calm down and at least look forward to something nice that calms her mind, as a benefit to her mind, If she's a Muslim, you talk about that. If as a Buddhist, you talk about the Buddhist things. That's to help the person go to the next life. This is the major point, that's why that title, and go happily to their next rebirth. Whereas the materialist one, it's marvellous already that people are coming to terms with death and less fear, but it's got to go further than that, The point of all of these instructions is for the sake of the dying one.
Yeah,
that's why to have no people with their attachment, don't show your emotions, get the troublemakers out of the room, get the pets out of the room, get all the other rubbish out of the room, so everything is conducive.
I send the parents out of the room,
Of course, that's the trouble.
At times they fight.
Exactly, it's beyond shocking.
Because they're so emotional.
Oh,
and
it's the worst. And that's why they don't think about the benefit of the child. And this is, of course, it's understandable. And that's why to be able to help a dying person, you've got to know yourself first. You've got to be clear and understand the process yourself. That's the point. It's so clear, isn't it? It's interesting. So interesting. So, okay, let's go through this process roughly, describing it in terms of the way this model will tell us the components of a person, what happens. So it's described in terms of 8 stages, okay? So at each of these stages, various things cease functioning, or sort of all the bits stop doing their job, like that. So the first one, okay, keeping it simple. The first one is the elements, the earth element. Okay, by the way, this is the same process that occurs when we go to sleep. So you listen to this, you'll see my point. The very first one, in the first of the 8 stages, the various things that occur, the first is one of the elements ceases to function. So this is the earth element, which gives the weight and the strength to our body. So when you're very tired, you can hardly move your body, you're so exhausted, isn't it? That's the earth element. It's not functioning properly. You're exhausted. When you wake up in the morning, you're so tired, you can hardly move your body, because the earth element hasn't come back yet, That's why you want to turn over and go back to sleep, isn't it? So the earth element ceases, the body becomes very kind of heavy, and it feels like it's sinking into the bed, At the same time, the I consciousness ceases to function properly. This process, they don't actually say it in the teachings, but you can extrapolate, you can deduce that this 8 stages probably takes a couple of hours. It doesn't occur like months and days before. This actual process, when you're actually beginning, we're dying slowly anyway, it's very clear, but there's what's called the death process doesn't really occur until a few hours probably before you stop breathing. There's 8 stages. So a person who's familiar with this from reading the teachings, from doing their own meditation, then they can be observing what stage their loved one is at, So, okay, the first one is the earth element ceases. And there's meditation. One of the meditations which they recommend is imagining going through these 8 stages, familiarising ourselves with it, so that when death does come, we can begin at least to have some sense of awareness of it, not just panic attacks, and indeed, therefore, can help other people. The I consciousness ceases. Also, there's another thing that occurs. They talk about this. They use these different concepts. There's this. Okay, when you're wide awake, there's these different capacities of the mind. You can see, or they call them the wisdoms. It just means the capacity of the mind. When you're wide awake, you can hold a lot of information in your mind at once, can't you? When you're really wide awake, all kind of perky and awake, you can hold lots of information, think of many things, see many things. But when you're really tired, you can hardly hold anything in your mind, isn't it? So this capacity to hold a lot of information is ceasing, getting smaller. So the I consciousness begins to cease, the earth element ceases, and this kind of capacity to hold a lot of information. They call it the wisdom of something or other, it doesn't matter. Then also, at a subtle level, which is not evident to us, every time we go to sleep, this actually occurs, but we never notice it, because we haven't practiced. There's this subtle kind of indicator or sign that occurs, which is like they say, it's like a mirage. So, a mirage is what? It's the interplay of earth and water, isn't it? So because the earth element is ceasing, and now the water element is now more prevalent. So now, in this state, this is sort of, gradual, incremental. Now the water element ceases to function, the liquids in the body begin to dry up, You know, when you wake up in the morning, your eyes are really dry, your mouth's dry, because temporarily throughout the night, the water element ceased to function. So it's got to come back, you know, you've got to drink and get things like, you know, watery again. At the same time, there's capacity, mental state, there's capacity to recognize, to distinguish between pleasure, pain, and indifference. So this is one of the states that we didn't discuss, but I want to go into it. One of the fundamental, every millisecond, we're experiencing either pleasant feelings, unpleasant feelings, or neutral. And we'll forget the neutral. If you want to track your day, you can track your day internally in terms of pleasure, you know, a little bit of pleasure, mild pleasure, real suffering, pleasure, suffering throughout the day. It's pleasant feelings and unpleasant feelings. This is the meaning of happiness and suffering, actually. I'll discuss this maybe if we have time. But here, the ability to distinguish between these. So maybe an hour ago when you weren't sleeping, you think of the delicious food. Like, I go on all these aeroplanes, okay? And because I'm attached to food, I like my dinner, you know. So you look forward to your nice dinner. Well, nice, maybe another story. Never mind. But if I'm tired on the plane, I'll pass the tray. I don't care. My sleep comes first because the ability, you know, my interest in food is gone. I'm more attracted to sinking into oblivion, you know. But if you're still awake, you kind of can't resist the food. So the ability to even distinguish between pleasure and pain, it kind of all merges into one. Who cares, you know? So the water element ceases. Your ear consciousness ceases by this point. So what's interesting, even by this point, because already you're losing the plot, you know. This is when they would say, there's one whole set of teachings in the Sutra teachings called the 12 links of dependent arising. It's Buddha's explanation of how we perpetuate the cycle of samsara, moment by moment. First you have consciousness, which then there's karma, then there's this, then there's that. And it's like this process, describing the process of how we perpetuate suffering. So at the time of death, so two of those, one is called, the eighth one is called, there's 12 of these. Eighth one is another model now called the 12 links, different from the 8 stages. So one is called craving and one is called grasping, 8th and 9th. So these, in particular at the time of death, are very, very potent. And all they are very strong attachment. So Buddha would say, basically, the way this universe is constructed due to delusions that we've created, attachment's the motor, like I've been saying, that keeps us alive. It's even the cause of having a body. It's every millisecond determining all our choices. So at the time of death, this attachment is very, very powerful, which is why people completely freak out, holding on to the present. You know? So this attachment is especially grasping at yourself, grasping at the body, grasping at your life, grasping at your loved ones, your pets. That's why if you're all around, all you're doing, if you're freaking out, is causing this enormous attachment in that person, whether it's a baby or your grandma, to be out of control, which is the worst thing possible for this poor person's precious mind. Because grasping and attachment brings incredible fear, you know, because finally you can't hold on to it anymore, you know. And then grasping comes. Craving first, then grasping, they call them those. That's even a more powerful level of attachment. And that's why death for many people is a complete nightmare. Everyone around crying, screaming, they haven't dealt with impermanence, they've never thought about death, they haven't worked on their mind, they haven't been conscious, they've lived, they've killed, they've lied, they've cheated. Now it's like a nightmare. It's not trying to be horrible. It's not death in its nature is not a nightmare. It's only because we've not been aware of it, haven't prepared for it. And so, of course, because of attachment, we cannot let go. It is unbearable. That's why the most precious thing, everything in that room should be conducive to the peace and the encouraging of peace and virtue in the dying person's mind. Everything in that room, it's like their gig, you know. We just don't see it that way. Especially when it's babies and beloveds, you know. It's the worst part, the greatest suffering, so painful. I remember one teaching, we were discussing the death process and how important it is to have the room to be peaceful. And one of the women in the group, she was saying that they were taking turns to help one of their friends die. So, you know, naturally you think will make them happy. So they, you know, she liked Patsy Cline, so they had Patsy Cline records on. They had her dog there, her cat all nestling up next to her, attached to her pets, attached to the music, her friends, you know. So the poor mind was running berserk. She couldn't die in peace because she was grasping so strongly. So my friend went home, she said, it was my job that night to help our friend. She took the cats and dogs out, turned off Patsy Cline, did some mantras, and the woman died peacefully. Because she was able to relax and die, you know. Not just relaxing and dying isn't the point, but to die well, with peace and virtue in the mind. So having things around that you hold on to, which is what we do in our lives. I mean, look at our lives, you know. We define ourselves in terms of our house, our body, our partner, our children, our possessions, our pension plan. We mightn't be that attached. Look at the world. We're not that bad. But we define ourselves in terms of all these things. And we spend our lives trying to kind of hold these things nicely together. You know? This is called attachment. Don't say you can't have nice things. You can. But we don't have to have attachment, which is very hard. Then we can enjoy them. They can be blissful. Come and go. You enjoy, you know? Which is one of the ways to think about death, which we'll talk about in a minute. I'm talking about the process now. So this grasping, when this comes, this ninth of these 12 links, then it's so powerful. What it does at the time of death is trigger, and it's all highly complex how it occurs, it triggers the karmic seed that will be the one that will throw you into the next life. That's why this point, and it happens around about, you can read from the teachings, it seems to happen around about this time when you've still got some relative level of gross consciousness. Because it's all going fast, you know. And that's where, for a Buddhist, the classic one would be to have, you play mantras, you talk about the Buddha, you talk about their Lama, we have a relationship with our teachers. Everything that's going into the ear of that person is keeping them focused. Because when you're dying, you've got no control, you know. You've got to hear things. Your poor mind can't put anything together. That's why the precious role of helping a person at the time of death. You've got to be kind, confident. Before they're dying, one of the things to do is to talk about their good qualities. You know, we're always worried about what we are. We're always negative, always guilty, always ashamed. Always, I did this wrong, I did that wrong, especially at death. What a good mother you've been. What a kind person you are. This is like nectar to their ears, to calm their mind, to make them uplifted. If they believe in heaven, tell them about heaven. The reincarnation, you talk about the next future life. Or, you know, they even talk about in Buddhism, pure lands of the Buddhas, another whole kind of discussion. So then you can die peacefully. And also, because you've got all this attachment, you can use attachment to look forward to something nice. It's kind of practical. So at this point is when it's really crucial, even before you stop breathing. This is when all the karmic seeds are starting to ripen, you know. That's why this is the time, if you hate your mother all her life, you be there right then. That's when you can help her best. To help her die in this life and go to the next one, the Buddha would say. You know. At the time you stop breathing, be there, right there, helping them through this, helping them be virtuous and peaceful, and putting decent imprints into their mind. You know. So then, by this point, your eyes are gone. Okay, you listen to this, how the eyes and the ears stop functioning. Let's say I'm having a chat with Prem, and I'm tired. Isn't it true? You're looking at him, and he's talking, and in your eyes, it's like you can't see anything, because you're so sleepy. When you're driving the car, and you're struggling against sleep. You can't even see what's in front of you. And then when you're talking to Prem, the next bit, you just lost the last 15 seconds, didn't you? You didn't hear what he said, because your ear consciousness ceased to function. You have that experience?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's because this is what's happening. These elements are ceasing. The ear consciousness ceases. Then, the next one, you no longer have this capacity to even recognise friends, enemies and strangers. You can have your ugly old mother over here, because you can't stand your mummy, and your beloved on this side, you've lost the plot. You can't tell the difference.
The third stage is the ear loss. Or
Sorry?
the ears and the eyes loss.
The first one is the eyes, second one is the ears.
Okay. That is 3 and 4.
1 and 2. Now we're up to 3. Okay. So the first one is your earth element ceases, the capacity to hold a lot of information ceases, and the eye consciousness ceases. And then this subtle sign of a mirage. There's 4 things. The second stage is the water element ceases. Yeah, we haven't finished the second stage. The water element ceases. Your capacity to distinguish between pleasure, pain, and indifference. And the ear consciousness ceases. And there's this subtle sign they call, it's like the interplay of water and fire, which is sort of like steamy or spark, steamy or kind of like smoky, you know. The next stage, the third stage, your capacity to even distinguish between friends, enemies and strangers. You've lost the plot. You can't tell. Your which one is it? No, which sense? It's we've got the ear, the eye, the ear, the taste. I think taste and smell and touch, isn't it? So Must be smell. Smell ceases here. Now the smell, the capacity to smell has gone, you know. And the capacity to distinguish between friends, enemies, strangers. Your smell consciousness, smell sense has gone, and the I'm getting lost. And the
distinguishing
between friends, enemies, and strangers. No, that's the second one.
That's the second. Okay.
This is between friends, enemies, and strangers. You can't even tell the difference between, you know, your beloveds and your enemies anymore. And then the subtle sign is like, again, it's the interplay between fire and air, because the 4 elements go in that order. So that's like sparks, you know, they call that sparks. So these are subtle, most people don't notice these. Then the final stage is your tactile consciousness and your tongue consciousness cease. This tongue, we know, people who work with the dying can know this, it turns, kind of shrinks and turns very hard and blue at the root. Well, as one Lama said, I love this, that tongue that has spent its life gossiping is now useless. And then the capacity to even know who you are, lost.
That's final.
Yeah, gone. It's the 4th stage. You no longer have any sense of who you are. You know how in normal daily life we know who we are in this most elaborate way in relation to the rest of the world. I'm me, I'm this person's husband, I'm that person's child, I'm this person's employee, I'm that person's employer, I like this music, I have those politics, I live in that country. This vast, elaborate picture we have of where we fit in everything, this is gone completely. No idea who you are, no sense of this anymore. You can no longer put anything together. And then also the breath stops. That's when the West would say you're brain dead, pretty much. But for the Buddha, your gross consciousness has ceased. Now you're continuing through this process, which could take up to 3 days. Now your subtle consciousness. And at each of these stages, there's various things you've got to do. And when the breath stops, there's certain things you should do as well. All that's in this book, you know. So now, this point, what's happening in the person, there's this very detailed descriptions according to the Vajrayana, similar to the Hindu views, about our subtle energy. So they talk about how we have these, physically we're made up of these 72,000, like a subtle nervous system, 72,000 subtle channels through which the wind energies, the prana, all course through. And this is this view about the mind. All of those wind energies are linked to different states of our mind, which is such a curious one to us because we think of the mind as the brain, you know. So they have a saying, say, the mind rides on the wind. So this is why if you go to your Tibetan doctor, or indeed your acupuncturist, you'll feel your pulses and feel the berserkness of the particular wind energies that are related to anger. So it's like this wild storm in you. You're out of control. Or your wind energies related to attachment, which brings huge anxiety and panic attacks. So the wind energies are berserk because your mind has made them berserk because they're intimately linked. So by taking your herbal medicines, you calm the winds down, which helps the mind calm down. Do you understand? That's the way they talk. In the West, we talk about your chemicals, and you take your serotonin, and then you can calm down, you know. So it's a different way of talking. So the wind energies coursing through the 72,000 subtle channels with all the states of mind. So what's happening here, when we're wide awake, and all the elements are working, because all the channels and the states of mind and the wind energies are all there. But as you're becoming unconscious, what's happening is all the wind energies, this is what happens when you sleep, connected to those states of mind, cease, they're all absorbing to the central channel. There's this one main central, in the nervous system, this one main central channel they call, that starts at the crown chakra and goes all the way down and finishes at the sex chakra, which for the male is the penis, so the end of the penis, and then for the female is the cervix. And then there's these 2 side channels they talk about, starting here, going up and then going down the length of the long one, the central one. And it's all not as simple as that. It's all kind of knotted up. And at each point, there are these what they call chakras, which are this coming together of all these other channels as well, all knotted together. Here, 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 below the navel, and several down there. These are kind of all these coming together. And what they're saying is, what we have to do is the mind, you know, when we start to go to sleep, the states of mind and their wind energies all absorb, all come into the central channel. So that's why we stop being conscious. They stop running in that part of the body. And then the death process, now the subtle consciousness continues to get more subtle, and the wind energy is absorbing all more, absorbing, coming down. There's this white, so they talk about, we have this other physical energy called the kundalini, the liquid energy, red and white. And the white is the white kundalini is the subtle level of the white sperm of the male, which we all have. And the red one is the subtle level of the red blood of the female, which we all have. And so this is a fundamental way we're made, constructed from the first second of conception. We begin at the heart chakra. Our consciousness goes into the egg and sperm, and then we begin to grow from the heart chakra. That's how they talk. It's a very different view, obviously. So these white and red are the fundamental components of the male and female person. So the white one is predominant here at the crown chakra, but it's throughout all the channels. But it's the main base, the main source of the bliss in our body, a capacity for pleasure. The red one is mainly at the navel, and this is the source of the heat in the body. So anyway, the white one now, the fifth stage of death, the white one goes down to the heart chakra. The heart chakra's centre, right here, in the centre of the chest, between the two breasts, where we begin. And then the next, there's various visions of things that occur. And then the red one comes up the central channel to the heart. And then these two, the sixth stage, and the seventh stage, these two kind of conjoin what they call this indestructible drop. The very subtle red and white drops that we began at the first second of conception, from which the whole body grew. And everything is absorbing there. And then the seventh stage is like this dark. You have a white appearance. The vision is like white when the white one goes down. There's a vision of like red when the red one comes up. This occurs every time we go to sleep. And the great yogis can go through this and be conscious of it. Then there's a black vision, like a deep unconscious. And then these two split. And this is what they call the eighth stage, which is the very subtle consciousness, or clear light consciousness. And this is the subtlest level of our being. So this might sit there for 3 days. It mightn't leave the body yet. But when it does, when these two separate, the white one will go down in the male. The white one goes down and leaves through the organ, and the red one goes up and leaves through the nose, but the female is the opposite. And that would be one of the signs that the mind has left the body. You see this kind of pinkish liquid here, or this whitish one, which is hard to see. But as long as the mind is still in the body, then it stays at the heart chakra. And one of the clear signs for whether the person has left the body or not, the consciousness, you feel the body, the rest of it just, you touch. Lightly, you shouldn't touch, but you'll feel it cold. But here, it's still warm. So it's easy to prove, from the Buddhist perspective, whether the mind is still there. If you put your heart above the heart chakra, you can feel warmth very vividly. The mind is still there. It stays there. And then when the time is ready for that person, the consciousness will leave the body. And they say the consciousness can leave from different places. And this could be an indicator of the type of rebirth they get. Of course, no one can know where it leaves because we're not clairvoyant. We can't see it. But the best one, they say, is it leaves through the crown. The best. So if you can't leave the body for 3 days, one of the instructions is very clear. You have the body for an hour. Before, it could be there for 3 days, but you have to encourage the consciousness to leave. And one of the best things to do, they say, is tap very strongly on the crown here, or pull the hair at the crown chakra. And that can cause the consciousness to go through there and leave from there. And that's a really good thing, because that can help them take a really pure, what they call a Buddha, a subtle kind of rebirth, not a human even, a really good rebirth around the Buddhas. I mean, this, we maybe talk about this. If it leaves through the mouth, it could be cause of spirit rebirth, which is not cool, not good for the person. If it leaves through the anus or the sex organ, animal rebirth. If it leaves through the eyes, human rebirth. They say like this. So why it's good not to touch the body? Because you can encourage the consciousness to leave, and it's not ready yet. Everything's very sensitive. So if you're going to leave your body for 3 days or even an hour, the Buddhist approach, you just have prayers, that's all. It's like a holy place for 3 days. Many people I know do that. Only prayers and things if they're Buddhist. Like one of my friends, her mummy died, she's a Buddhist, the daughter's Buddhist. They'd take turns saying prayers throughout the time in the room. The only thing that's there is the prayers, because this can also help the consciousness even though it hasn't left the body yet. So when the mind leaves the body, then it kind of is the very subtle consciousness. It then goes through a reverse process of like waking up again or taking a rebirth, but this time like taking a rebirth, but not a rebirth, in the intermediate state. It's like when you go to sleep, you go to everything absorbs in the same way, and you get to very subtle consciousness, but it's not as profound as when it happens at death. And then you wake up, if you like, in a kind of mini wake up, and you've got your dreams. That's your subtle consciousness. So the intermediate stage is just like that, the bardo they call it. The intermediate stage. I've got a feeling the observations of all the great Christian yogis, they call it purgatory. Do you understand? So there's so many similarities, you see it in the teachings. It's just that for me, the difference is the interpretation of what it is and who sends you there, or you send yourself, or whatever it is. It's the interpretation of what it is. But the observations seem very similar, don't they? Of hells, this kind of thing. It's kind of interesting. Actually, reminds me, this Christian, years ago, somebody pointed me out a video online, years ago, in the 90s I saw it, called To Hell and Back. And this Christian doctor, you know, he started hearing stories from his patients who had near-death experiences, who had leaving their body experiences. And, you know, people do report these, and it's always about white light and this kind of thing. He had people reporting hell-like experiences, you know. Of course, we don't like those. But it was really interesting. So there are two I remember. It was really fascinating. I'll tell you. Drink my water. My water element is always going. My voice is always dry now. Is that just old age? Maybe it's old age and you become a baritone, don't you? Ladies become baritones. Isn't it? Dry out. Do I have to try and talk up there? But when I sing, I can sing high. It's interesting. My mother taught me singing when I was like 14. She must have taught me how to hold my breath because I can still do it. I don't know how to do it, I just do it. It's funny, isn't it? Anyway. Okay. I'll try and talk high. Keep my voice clear. Okay. Where are we? Where were we?
About the two stories.
Oh, the two stories. Yeah, that's very fascinating, these. So one of them was this bloke, who was a businessman, kind of said he was mean to his wife and just kind of self-centered. And he had to have a heart operation. So he's in the hospital, very worried about his heart operation. Worried when they're going to come and get him, you know. So suddenly he sees him, suddenly he's standing next to his wife at the bed and he's talking to her and she doesn't answer. And he gets kind of angry. And then he kind of notices the bed and he observes that his body is there. And he kind of vaguely kind of gets the idea that he's left his body, but he couldn't quite get it, you know. So he'd left his body, and then he suddenly heard these voices. Come on, John, come on. Oh, good, they're coming to get me for my operation. So he went outside, and then they walked along this corridor. So first of all, I find this totally fascinating. He said, I'll tell the rest of the story. He said, the walk along that corridor took as long as walking from here to Alaska. Now, even if it was in Oregon, that's an interesting concept. In other words, what's a concept of time? It's a human, the way we have conception of time, it's a very human thing, isn't it? We have a real feeling of how long a minute is, how long a day is. But look, when you're very happy, it goes quickly. Look, when you're very suffering, it goes agonizingly slow, doesn't it? We really, the feeling of time is very interesting. So, okay, we measure it in terms of seconds and hours and days. But this experience he had, he couldn't have left his mind for more than a couple of minutes, can you, before you're brain dead? Is that right? Do people know? People, nurses, do you know how long you have to leave your body before you're brain dead? How long you stop breathing before you're brain dead?
Oh, how long you stop?
Yes, stop breathing before you're brain dead. A couple of minutes?
Yeah, no, 3.
3 minutes. So there he is. He obviously, his consciousness, using the Buddhist view, his consciousness left the body. That means his body looked like it was dead. That's one of the things about the Buddhist view. People can leave their consciousness often. There's so many stories of people in the coffin, banging on the coffin. They can wake up because their gross consciousness ceased. They stopped breathing, but they didn't have the karma to die yet. It's so fascinating. So there he is. He's left his body, but his experience was it took as long as walking from here to Alaska. So the experience of time was so long. Isn't that fascinating? Anyway, what happened was he was, you know, they were all kind of these people. Were kind of all yucky and nice, he said. And then they started to be mean to him, ripping his flesh, beating him up, abusing him. It was the worst experience of his life, he said. And then they left him, and he was in the depth of darkness, the likes of which he'd never known before. Darkness and despair. And he didn't know what to do. So then he said, I thought I'd better pray. But he hadn't prayed since he was a boy, so he started with Our Father who art in heaven, and he couldn't go any further. The Lord is my shepherd, he couldn't go any further. And then he just cried out, Jesus, help me. So from way over there, a tiny light came, and it got bigger and more powerful and more strong. He said if it had been alive and normal, it would have destroyed him. And as it got closer and closer, more and more bliss completely healed him, made him blissful and radiant. And of course, it was Jesus, he said. He called it Jesus. And that's how it is interesting due to your karmic imprints. For him, the manifestation of this energy was called Jesus. I mean, it'd be a big surprise if some green lady came along that we'd call Tara. He would have got a big shock. But his karmic appearance was with Jesus, so he called it Jesus. You know, you read all the near-death experiences, you call it what you're used to calling it, you know, God or whatever you want to call it. You label it that, you know. So it's interesting. So anyway, he was completely blissed out and he wanted to go with Jesus, but Jesus told him to go back. So he did, and he served Jesus, you know. Of course you would, wouldn't you? But the other experience was this fellow who was an alcoholic. And he had a near-death experience, and like they all describe, like going along a tunnel, and the Buddhists say the same thing, that's the experience, but it was like this hideous tunnel, at the end of which was this hideous fire, conflagration, what he labelled hell. And all his friends who died were there. So, of course, this is how Dante describes them. This is how the Tibetans describe them. You see, you know, there's this one kind of thing, there's this person, there's a type of woman, mainly a woman in Tibet, who can lie, they're yoginis, you know, they're practitioners. They can lie down on they're called Delong. They lie on their bed, they die, they leave their body for days, and they go to all the different realms of existence, meaning the experiences of the minds, and they come back with all reports. You know, that Mary who died last week, she's now in hell, and she said this and that. Very hilarious, very wonderful. I mean, you take it as a joke or you take it as seriously. But the way it always is, that whenever she met the Tibetans, of course they look like Tibetan ladies with their Tibetan aprons and everything, because she was a Tibetan, so things appeared like Tibetan. So he saw his friends in their human form. Well, clearly, if there's a mental state called hell, you have the karmic appearances of nightmares, monstrous suffering, mental suffering. It couldn't be a physical body. That's ridiculous, you know. But that's the appearance you have. That's how it appears to your mind, karmically. So he said all his friends were there screaming at him, go back, don't you come here, go back, go away, go back, go back, go back, you know. So he woke up and he served Jesus too. I mean, you would, wouldn't you? So this is Christian experience, how they label it. A Buddhist would label it differently because they've got a Buddhist view, you know. I don't know what a communist would label it, just they'd be surprised. They're not. Well, it's like that doctor recently who's written a book, you know. A typical scientific doctor who had a materialist view, and he died and all these visions, and of course he calls it God, because that's the view that we're used to. It's up to the view you're brought up with, you know. Do you understand my point? Anyway.
How he described it?
Well, he had all these visions of God and things happening, vivid, like his dream state, like his subtle consciousness. But because he's familiar with Christianity, that's the ones he's used to, even though he's a materialist, that's how he describes. But if it's a Buddhist person, you'd describe it in Buddhist terms, wouldn't you? You'd have Buddhist visions, because your mind creates those visions. Your mind creates those, you know. Okay, so now, when you leave the body, depending on the karma that ripened before you stopped breathing, already by then, as I said before, you're programmed. The seed that will, in our case, and this is what Lama Zopa said, at the time of our past death, being human now, at the time of our past death, at that time before we stopped breathing, we can deduce that we died peacefully and virtuously because the virtuous karmic seed that threw us into our present mummy's womb began to be triggered. At the same time, all our tendencies, that are the ones we are now expressing in this life, the seeds of those were triggered. All our experiences, the kind of parents and all the siblings and all the people you meet in this life, that was all triggered. And even your environmental karma, all the whole package was all triggered by that point, already programmed before you even left the previous body. And then when they die, assuming nothing changes by that point, you know, your consciousness leaves, and then it was in this intermediate state, and you're kind of bopping around, very intense. This is like a dream state, but very intense. And in a sense, this grasping is very powerful. In our case, as Lama Zopa says, when that grasping, the ninth link occurred, the grasping, because we'd practiced virtue and everything, then this grasping went to the next rebirth. We were grasping at a human birth. Well, like the Christian would be grasping at heaven. That will be a cause for them to go to this experience, have a mental experience labelled God realm. So anyway, our mind left the body. It was in this intermediate state, which lasts up to 7 human weeks. There's all these descriptions of it. And then when my new mummy and daddy, came together, hopped into bed, that's when the condition came. And then I would see them, the karma would ripen between us. And suddenly the karma would ripen, and then I would run instantaneously magnetised to go to that human womb, to go to the egg and sperm. But what's interesting, because this realm, Buddha says it's a desire realm, it's driven by attachment. Our bodies are the product of attachment. This body is a manifestation of walking attachment. 5 senses that crave feeding, This whole realm is created by our attachment over eons of time, Buddha says. So craving is the main cause of taking rebirth. You see in your mummy and daddy, and the traditional teaching is that if you're going to be born a girl, you run like a magnet with strong attachment to your father. If you're going to be born a boy, you run with strong attachment to your mummy. And then you die from the intermediate state and you zap into that new egg and sperm. And that's usually at the time of conception, when the egg and sperm come together.
If you're going to be born a girl, or if you were a girl? If you're going to be
if you're going to be born a girl,
then
you're attracted to your father. Freud would really like that, actually, isn't it? Because attachment runs the show. Attachment is the energy of this realm, which is why it's our most greatest suffering, So then off you go. We started, there I was. Rabina began.
Why is the girl attracted to the father and the boy?
Because, okay, look at the
How
world.
do you explain?
Yeah, of course. Look at our bodies. We understand what we call sexual attachment, don't we?
Yeah.
And the old-fashioned view of sexual attachment is a boy, he's got a long thing, and the girl's got a hole in which they join. I mean, excuse me. So eons of time, Buddha says, karmically, because of attachment growing, we literally, it's like karmic evolution, we have literally, through our attachment over many, many lives, from before this human realm, we've created these types of bodies. Our attachment has created these bodies over many lives, eons of time. And so then it's this mutual relationship, isn't it, between these 2 types of bodies? Is it not? Let's call it what we call sexual attachment. Attachment...
Inherited throughout.
Huh?
It would be inherited throughout.
Huh?
You mean it would be inherited throughout, this type of attraction?
Inherited.
Like, it would be inherited in the body throughout the different lives.
Yeah, okay. Yes, right, it's like that. So let me just explain a little bit more here. According to the Buddhist view, time is beginningless. We've got endless lives, we've had countless universes, and all these universes are the product of the collective sentient beings who created them, whether they're hell realms, or spirit realms, or God realms, or human realms, or animal realms. The shape that our bodies take, the form that our mind, the way our mind experiences things, is all due to a combination of virtue and non-virtue, depending on the scale, the spectrum, So, eons ago, what they call a human birth, because the human qualities are said to be the virtues. The virtues are the human qualities. The non-virtues, craving, attachment, killing, lying, all these are animal activities, actually. Not being mean, we've all been these countless times. So eons before this human planet, a human birth was much higher, we had subtle light bodies, more like gods. But enormous virtue lasted a long, long time and could get enlightened very easily. But we didn't have any of the gross delusions. So therefore, that's why the mind, because there were no gross delusions, the physical energies were subtle. So over eons of time, the seeds of attachment began to grow and got stronger and stronger and polluted our wind energies, and gradually, literally evolutionary-wise, we began to literally grow human bodies plonked on this earth looking like a bunch of apes. So from the Buddhist perspective, in terms of, if you look at evolution, I don't quite know when, you see, the way the materialists talk about evolution, they talk about human way back, the missing link business. They talk about, almost like looking like an animal, the bent over blokes, isn't it? They say they're human, don't they? But the Buddha would say human means virtue and intelligence. Now, I'm not sure that those blokes looking like that were very intelligent. You kind of see my point? This is me speculating. So human for the Buddha means the virtues and intelligence and wisdom. Can you hear me? So I'm wondering at what point we began to have wisdom and intelligence in the human realm. It couldn't be many thousands of years ago. Are you sort of seeing what I'm saying? People? This is my thinking, that's all. So then we've grown these long things and holes that they go into, and eyes and ears and that. We've grown it from attachment. Attachment has polluted the wind energies and literally evolutionary-wise grown these organs. So the fundamental attachment we can see is related to the body itself, which is what we call sexual. But attachment is the same, whether it's cake or a body. It's just a question of degree. So then, because this is a desire realm, it's personification of attachment. Either the hell realm where you don't get what attachment needs, or the blissful one in the God realm where you're completely only getting what attachment needs. Do you see what I'm saying? So then, from life to life, because we're driven by attachment, this is what causes rebirth. Causes. You're attracted to your new parents, you know. You run like a magnet. Powerful karma drives you to each other. And it's attachment that drives you. I mean, attachment compels us to do whatever we do every millisecond. Every millisecond, we're responding to attachment, you know. We're not noticing it because it's so subtle. That's why we have to learn to have control and awareness. So any questions before we have tea?
Robina,
Yeah.
surely a tadpole or a being of that
Yes,
simplicity
yes.
has also attachment. If you
Totally.
go right back to
All
single
sentient beings are driven by attachment. Yeah.
So
All.
it wasn't only when we evolved into humans.
Oh my God, no. No, attachment is all beings. I was just talking about the one of being the subtle human to the grosser human, which is what we are now with animal bodies, basically. How it's all driven by attachment. But all the hell realms are driven by attachment. All the spirit realms are driven by attachment. All the gods are driven by attachment. All the tadpoles, the creatures, the lions, every being is driven by attachment.
It's almost like a reproductive survival instinct of the...
It is. That's what we call it in the West, but virtually attachment is that. It's completely instinctive because we've practiced it for so long. Well, that's why we can learn. That's why we can learn to change it and get rid of it, you know, and go beyond it, which almost seems impossible, you know.
I recently, it's very interesting that I chose today to come here
Yeah.
because I recently have gone through this whole thing with my mother died at 99 in July.
My
in England,
goodness.
And I went through her whole, and she was in a nursing home, so I went through
Yes.
many weeks. I luckily could be with her, and it was a very powerful, very extraordinary experience, and I was holding her when she died. And
Wonderful.
we were in a nursing home in the West. So
Was it peaceful?
because
Was
I'm
it?
a Buddhist, my fear, which I had not really prepared for because I was here and I flew from Paros back to England, was that the process of this clinical, okay, she's alive, you know, everybody's giving her things to help her be alive, and then suddenly she's dead, and then along comes the undertaker, and, you know, you have to wash her and clean her. And it's like, hey, you know,
That's
slow
right.
down.
Precisely.
So there needs to be maybe even some legal process
That's
because
right.
we can't all die at home.
That's right,
So
precisely.
can't you, like your
But
friend-
that's where, no, you see, the point there is, I don't think
I
it's,
was quite
I understand that.
shocked because I
know.
learned all these
Exactly.
things that you're talking about. So, you know, I was not wanting to get her into her clothes and
Precisely.
push her and move
Precisely.
her around.
But see, the point here is, what's your name, please?
Philida.
Philida, the point here is, there are laws, in fact, and I got a person to do a bit of research, and it's surprising that many of the laws are so spacious. You're allowed to have, in some places you're allowed to have your loved one at home, you can leave them for days, there's no law that says you can't. So our job is to know what the laws are and know what our rights are. So the hospitals are geared to this. But, you know, if you know what your rights are, thank you very much, I'm going to close the door now, I will stay with my mother, please, goodbye. When I'm ready, I'll call you. We have to know that and not be overwhelmed by their procedures. We have to know that in advance, Philida, because you're the one in control. That's a really major point. Because the laws of that hospital would not disallow you from having her for at least an hour. No way.
No, that was okay. I did postpone it like that, but even so, it was 7 o'clock at night. So, you know, they had to be at midnight. She had to be even taken away. You know.
So their laws demanded she leave, you mean? Are you saying
Yeah,
that? Or they just wanted it?
It was summertime. They couldn't have somebody who had died overnight.
Okay, so this is, I understand, Philida, I understand. But again, the key is, forget the laws, it's you, I mean, you're pretty good, but you need to be so confident what you can do. So I remember one time when a friend of ours, the father of a friend, the father, the mother, and the daughter, all Buddhists, and we were in Santa Cruz. And then, it was interesting, he always said he had a bad heart, he always said to his wife, don't call the ambulance if I drop dead. But she panicked and did, you know. So they dragged her off to the hospital and him to the Santa Cruz hospital, stuck all the wires in to keep him breathing. And we knew he didn't want this. So at dawn, you know, me and the daughter went there. and we got them to take the wires. He stopped breathing. We did all the prayers, and they were very kind. They were supportive. We were in charge, very clear. You know, they had to take him away. They wouldn't let us keep him. When Lama Yeshe died, which I'll talk about later, my Lama, in the 80s, in Los Angeles, they let us take the body. It was amazing the way he died. I'll tell you about it. But this one, we couldn't take the body, so they were so gentle. They wrapped her up they had on the bed. They put the bag, put him gently in the ambulance, took him gently to the mortuary, and then we did a deal with the mortuary where we could keep him there and said prayers all day. And then at 4 p.m. they had to lock him up in the fridge. But they promised, we gave him the Gyuto monks chanting, and they promised they'd play the Gyuto monks all throughout the night in the fridge. So all the people got, so they could have something. Then we came back next day and did the same thing. So we negotiated because we knew what our rights were, and they were kind and tried to help us do it. So it can be very efficient, all these things, and if you're not ahead of it, of course they'll do what they have to do. But it's okay. How long did you have with her before they took a body, before they touched a body? How long did you have with her?
Well, the carers came to help me to wash her, so I suppose it was an hour.
You see, this is the thing, you don't have to wash her. You don't have to do those things. We just tend to follow what people say. That's why we should be prepared. You were pretty much. Did you do all the things like touching her crown?
I did.
You did?
I mean, I was alone with her, as you talked about the dying process.
Yes.
I was alone with her during all of that.
Good.
She was on one of
But you were saying prayers and things all the time.
awful morphine trips.
I understand. Were you saying prayers all the time?
Well, from my kind of...
Not out loud, with your mouth?
No.
Okay, that's what you should have done. Never mind, don't feel bad. It's okay. She's got to hear them. Shout the prayers at her. It's okay, she's dead now. It's all right. But you understand my point. It's okay. Feel it up. Anyway, you did beautifully. You darling mummy. You had prayers done afterwards and everything?
I mean, I've had quite a lot of training, so I should have done more, but I should.
That's okay. It's hard to know.
It was in Brighton, in England, which is very.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Strong for
I understand.
Understandable for
yes,
practice.
I understand, Philippa.
In Australia, they're probably sympathetic too.
So this is why this book. When I started editing Rinpoche's teachings, I had to decide who to address the book to. And then I remember one of my friends said, well, if it's addressed to the helpers, what about the poor dying people? But we're not stupid. We're all reading it. We know it refers to us. But you've got to address it to the helpers because, it's about how to help the dying person. So that way, but it's obvious if you read it, you learn yourself how to die. It's clear. So that's why it's so necessary for us to know all the steps and know what's important. And, well, of course, from the Buddhist perspective, it really does prepare us. And this book is like a handbook, So helpful. Because there's so many of these lamas give all these teachings, it's just confusing. We never quite know. That's why I had to do it in a kind of chronological order, so we know what to do when.
Has this book already come out?
No, what it is I finished the manuscript, and then Wisdom Publications will publish it in about a year in a very modified version. Anyway, it's different. They've done different things to it. But the version that I did, which is this one, it's coming out it'll be available in about 2 weeks as a downloadable free PDF from FPMT. It'll be announced, and then we're nearly finished. The designer's nearly finished. We're just working on corrections. I'd say it'll be a couple of weeks to be ready. So just look out for the Dying Book Lama Zopa on FPMT, or just Google it and it'll come up, I think. Should be ready.
What's it called?
It's called How to Help Our Loved Ones Enjoy Death and Go Happily to Their Next Rebirth. That's the title. That's exactly how Lama Zopa talks. It's like ridiculous from the Western point of view. It's embarrassing. Wisdom can't stand that title. They've changed it to sort of How to Help the Dying, and then they've got this little baby subtitle. I insisted they have the subtitle, but it's the title for me. It's the meaning, Listen, it's tea time. Then have some more questions after that. You okay?
Yes.
What, darling?
It may sound a bit off topic, but we say so many things about death. What about the procedures of birth? Because we live in a world...
Birth's not the point, dear. Conception is the point.
Okay.
Not birth, bugger birth. You just come out, Be reasonable. Call the doctors for that one. Conception is the point. There's a beautiful book. There's a beautiful book called The Tibetan Art of Parenting, and it's interviews with Tibetan women, how they prepare to get pregnant, not to be birth, because you've got to attract the right consciousness. And this is a really interesting point, You think, the more and more gross we are with sex, and there's violence, and there's rape, and there's uncontrolled sex, and there's sex while you're drugged out of your brain, there's drug sex. Don't be moralistic here. What kind of consciousnesses do you think you're attracting? Poor old suffering consciousnesses. So they talk about having really good sex, Holy sex. We don't mean it can be good sex. Of course it can. But you do your practices beforehand, you purify, because they want to attract a decent consciousness to come. And the consciousness you attract is depending on how you are when you're, not just being like some kind of animal, with respect to animals. So it's conception's the point, baby. Birth's nothing. I mean,
What
birth...
about the fear?
What?
What about the fear?
What
that
fear?
The fetus can have when it comes in a way that is not so, let's say, natural, not so calm.
Darling, forget calm, the best for me is have cut the person open and take the baby out gently. I think any birth is like a bloody nightmare. Natural, for me, is the most dreadful experience. Birth is like horrendous. I think you all should have cesarean. We're just worrying about them. I mean, truly, the baby's peaceful. You just cut it out. Hello, baby. But this nightmare of going through a thin tube, I mean, talk about horror. Natural or not, I think it's dreadful. I would recommend cesarean for everybody. This is my view.
My baby was the only one who wasn't crying.
There you go. Well done.
I was having the cesarean.
There you go. Of course not. It's peaceful. Hello, mummy. You open your eyes. God.
Everybody was crying. I was looking who the one who was not crying was mine.
There you go, darling. I mean, that's just my view there. So I think death is I think birth's the most hideous experience. Nightmare. Coming through this thin tube. Scare the life out of you. No wonder you come out screaming. If you did that to a live baby, they'd put you in prison. But that's called birth, and we think, oh, it's so special. Anyway, that's my opinion, excuse me. I'll see you guys in half an hour.